Hello, I'm Harold Munro, Editor-in-Chief at the Vancouver Sun and Province, joined by Katie De Rosa, our legislative reporter in Victoria, who's not at the legislature this week because the House isn't sitting. Good morning, Katie.
Nope, just working from the comfort of my own home. So good morning.
Nice. Well, you had a busy week. I mean, it's always busy when the ledge is sitting, but some interesting new legislation. A little puzzling. You were telling me about the bubble zone that the government introduced around schools to prevent SOGI protests, but it's not exactly in place right now. So explain what's going on there, please.
Yeah, so basically what for the Premier David Eby was saying last week during the press conference is that, when he takes his kid to school, the things he thinks about, is my son going to get along with everyone at school? Is he going to be, cooperative with his teachers? But he shouldn't have to, as a parent, think about, are there going to be protesters, around the school talking about hormone therapy and indoctrination, which is definitely a specific reference to some of the anti-SOGI protests. And SOGI stands for sexual orientation and gender identity in schools. That's the sort of policy that basically says, there could be gender neutral washrooms and that students will be accepted if they want to change their pronouns. And there are some parents who say they're against that. They say it's teaching kids that it's indoctrinating kids. That's some of the language that's used, and some of the language that was used by Eby to sort of criticize the tactics of these protesters. And he said that there have been, in the last year, 18 protests around schools across the province that are, again, could be intimidating to students. And he said, again, some of the tenor of these protests is particularly harmful to, say, a trans student who is at higher risk of self-harm or suicide. And so that's the stakes here. But I think the thing that raised a lot of questions is that the so-called bubble zones, that ban on any protests on school property, are not automatically established. The NDP cabinet has to meet to establish a so-called bubble zone. So that raised questions of, how who is the government going to, say, monitor social media and say, okay, there's a protest that we think is going to be, harmful to students, so we're going to establish the bubble zones. So the Attorney General, Nikki Sharma, was asked about that. She said, we wrote it that way so that we can be nimble and respond to, certain incidents happening. But, for example, BC Conservative leader John Rustad said it opens the door to the government sort of targeting protests that, again, anti-SOGI protests as opposed to other types of protests. He said the government has completely allowed, he said anti-Semitic protests. I think he's referencing some of the pro-Palestinian protests. He's saying those are problematic and those are allowed to happen without any action, but the government's targeting anti-SOGI protests, which he said, are not hateful, but legitimate questions from parents on their rights in schools. So questions of why the government wrote the legislation that way, and whether that's the right approach.
So we're not that far from a provincial election, and as we know, you get a lot of different protests for a lot of different causes during a provincial election, and obviously cabinet isn't sitting during an election. So what would happen in October if there were to be a protest?
Well, I mean, that's a great question. Is it the caretaker cabinet that has sort of an emergency meeting? I mean, it is important to note that the ban will not include any kind of labor protest. So a picket line, for example, is still allowed. Any protest that's organized by students, let's say students are upset with cafeteria prices, that can go ahead. So again, it's definitely targeting. It opens the door for the government to decide which protests it believes are potentially harmful. But I think during an election period, that's a great point. And there is a sunset clause on the legislation. So July 1st, 2026, this legislation will expire unless the government chooses to renew it. So similar to what happened with the bubble zones around hospitals during the pandemic, when there was anti-vax protests and there was a recognition that healthcare staff needed to be protected when they go to work. They shouldn't be called, they shouldn't be called names for administering vaccines. But that legislation is now expired, so we don't have that anymore. It was specific to the pandemic. But another example that's kind of an opposite approach is the bubble zones around abortion clinics. That still exists. That was created to prevent anti-abortion protests, and that's still in effect. So it's definitely an interesting approach to sort of have this specific time period.
Hmm. Well, I mean, it is it's interesting legislation, as you say, and regardless of your personal politics, I would suggest, because right now, obviously, we have an NDP government, but who knows? After October, we could have a Conservative or BC United or Green government, and then that cabinet will be able to cherry pick whichever protests they decide are harmful and ban them. So yeah, I guess careful what you wish for.
Yes, yeah. And we've seen other legislation that has this kind of broad approach. For example, the government's legislation on ability to sue companies for health-related harms, again, targeted at social media companies, but a big question of, well, can you sue an oil company for health-related harms? Can you sue a junk food, a company that sells junk food if they promote obesity? So another area where there was a piece of legislation that has been criticized as being sort of too broad, and questions of where it could go.
Right. Okay. There's also, of course, the political side of this. Like, you've got the opposition and the Conservative and BC United, and where they stand on this legislation. You mentioned that Rustad, the Conservative leader, is dead set against it. Where Kevin Falcon and his BC United party on this?
Yeah, Kevin Falcon was sort of somewhere in between. He said he needs to study the legislation before he decides where he stands on it. But he did say it's a peculiar way to bring in a piece of legislation, again pointing to this requirement for cabinet to suddenly meet. And he did agree that sometimes parents might have legitimate concerns about wanting to be involved in their child's education. So I definitely think it's a wedge issue between the BC United and BC Conservatives, and it sounds like Kevin Falcon hasn't really found his firm position on this issue. He's really kind of struggled in the middle of where he falls on the SOGI issue.
Okay. Okay, completely different topic. The Surrey police transition, which has been this ongoing, continuing saga. Surrey going from RCMP to municipal force, the Surrey Police Service. Last week, Surrey Mayor Brenda Locke and council majority, at least we assume it wasn't all of them, but it may have been, because it was all done behind closed doors. But they rejected BC government's final offer of $250 million to help cover transition costs to the new police force. At least Minister Farnworth presented it as a final offer. So where does that leave us?
Well, again, if you ask our colleague Vaughn Palmer about whether or not it's final, I think his answer was yeah, right. So I think that's a lot of people are questioning whether final offer actually means final offer. But I think it was, surprising when we found out the amount that was involved. It was around 250 million. The original 150 million plus 20 million a year over 5 years that would cover additional wages. For example, if the wages of Surrey police officers were higher than RCMP officers. But basically, Brenda Locke is saying, see you in court. Like, we want the courts to decide this as to whether Surrey has the ability to decide its own fate. The province is saying, no, it's in the province's court. We have made a legislation that says that the Surrey Police Service is the police department will be the police of jurisdiction. Of course, the RCMP is still the police of jurisdiction, but Minister Farnworth said we should find out this week, perhaps, how exactly that transition is going to take place, when Surrey Police will become the force of jurisdiction, and how the hiring process will happen. Whether RCMP officers will have to be working under SPS for a certain time until the transition is totally complete. Right now, again, it's the opposite. RCMP is has the control, and Surrey police officers are working under the RCMP. But the RCMP union has said they think it could actually require federal legislative changes to allow Mounties to work under a municipal force. So a lot of questions there. Minister Farnworth again said it's not decided in Ottawa; it's decided by the province of BC. So he feels like he's on firm footing. But I mean, there's a lot of details that are still fuzzy, and Mayor Brenda Locke is basically saying the court will decide. So it's the fight is not letting up.
Well, I guess it's 2 weeks from today that court case is scheduled to begin. I mean, again, we're 6 months from an election, so as with SOGI or anything, there's always a political element to these things. And one of the things that, as you know, Brenda Locke was threatening last week was that if they go ahead with this, she'll bring in a revised budget in the fall, meaning likely before the October election, to let Surrey taxpayers know how that's going to hit them in their pocketbook. And she threw out some pretty big numbers there. That I guess is within her purview to do something like that. But given that there's 9 seats in Surrey, 7 now held by the NDP, and there'll be a 10th one in this election. So that's a big chunk of seats at stake.
Yeah, she wants taxpayers to know that if this is on the provincial government, if there's increases, that she wants the government to wear this. But I think that's why the original 150 million, when that was initially said to be the final offer, the government obviously was able to cough up another 100 million on top of that. So so far the final offers have not been final offers, and I think that speaks to the balance of power, that the government is afraid of losing Surrey seats and losing sway in Surrey, when perhaps Surrey residents are saying, Brenda Locke is protecting protecting us from tax increases from this transition. So the politics is at play, and it is definitely the fight is not over.
I should point out, of course, I mean, it's going back a long ways, and some people won't remember this, but Brenda Locke in the distant past was a BC Liberal MLA from Surrey. So her politics certainly don't necessarily align, at least they didn't then, with the NDP, and clearly they don't align with them on this issue. And I think she also has some concerns about upzoning and some of the various other things that they're bringing, the NDP government has been bringing in. So I could certainly see her trying to use this as a wedge issue if it's not resolved before then. But we'll see what the courts decide, or maybe there'll be a last second deal on the courthouse step, which wouldn't be the first time.
I mean, court cases often get settled out of court, so we'll have to see. But I'm very interested to hear this week if we're going to hear from Farnworth on more details on the transition plan. I think everyone wants to hear that as well. So we'll definitely keep readers updated with our coverage.
I mean, it's been very frustrating because you and other reporters like Gord Hoekstra and Vaughn, as you say, we've not been able to get the actual numbers from either side, right? It's all subject to NDAs. And whenever we do FOIs, we just get blank documents back. So, we don't really know what the true numbers are. Are they Farnworth's numbers, or are they Brenda Locke's numbers?
Exactly. Yes. And again, so Brenda Locke said last week, we haven't seen a detailed transition plan. So both sides are saying they're not seeing the information that the other is presenting. And again, is that accurate, or is that politics? It's hard to tell here.
No, and either way, it's not good news for taxpayers, because any of this sort of dysfunction is only going to contribute to costs either way. So anyways, we'll stay in touch, Katie. Maybe we'll be talking about this again next week. Thank you.
I think we might. We probably will. Thanks, Harold.